before we get started, I just wanted to clarify that for today's purpose, when we talk about a voice experience, a VUI, we mostly refer to digital voice assistant. There are other conversational agents that are probably simpler. This is the most complex one, and when you add the multilingual aspect, is even more complex. But this year is 10 years that the first voice assistant was introduced in the market. So it's an important milestone. And the increase in use and popularity is really becoming very hard to ignore. So let's get started. As an icebreaker, maybe you can, each of our panelists can briefly tell us how they came to the world of voice. And if you have a fun fact or something, feel free to share that. Shamala, why don't you get started?
Yeah, well, it's a very long story. In 2012, when I used to work for Amazon, I participated in a hackathon, and interestingly, I am very fond of hackathons. So I participated in a hackathon where my idea was e-trial solution, and I wanted to see how I can use augmented reality and voice together to design something where people can try online products before buying. And that product was very well received. So I prototyped the entire experience using voice. And it was not as mature back then, but that's how my journey started. And then I was part of the Amazon Gen 1 and Gen 2 launch. And from there, my experience just evolved working with different companies, including VoiceBox Technology, which was acquired by Nuance, and now at Ford.
Great. Susan?
Sure. I come from a different perspective in that I didn't come from a technical. I actually spent 20 some years doing UX and content strategy and digital strategy. During that time, I did deal with IVRs and actually even a virtual assistant, an avatar that was working through with multilingual experiences. It was then in like 2017 that my husband started telling me all about voice. And one of the things, and Shamala knows this, I'm a few credits short of being a medievalist. Which, how does that work with tech? Well, back in those days, it was very much about voice and news. It wasn't about written word, it was about spoken word. And it's amazing to see how this is now coming, like everything that's old is new again, and seeing how all of that comes together, seeing the potential for inclusivity, the potential for the sharing of information, was just so exciting to me from that perspective that was something that I wanted to take advantage of. So that was then where we started to shift pragmatic digital completely to voice.
That's great. Angel?
I think in comparison to Shamala and Susan, my introduction into the world of voice is fairly recent. I was introduced to the world of voice when I joined the Google Assistant personality team roughly about 4 years ago. My background was always in localization, and so there was the idea of language and how do we use that with text and how we use that with voice, and also with language learning, where text and voice is very important for that kind of industry. And in joining the Google Assistant personality team, I'm working with a wonderful team of content strategists and designers who had to think about conversation design and how we can launch into other markets and continue to have the concept of a consistent persona when we come to having a very great voice user experience.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a field that has been really pioneered by Google. When I started dipping my toes in voice, one of the first book was Kathy Pearl's book on VUIs, and it's a really great introduction to how you build a voice experience and conversations. And if thinking from the language perspective, probably about 50%, I think, of the world languages are only spoken. So, if you think about the potential of voice, and so many people that also don't have access to education, but they can understand and speak. The potential is really great for this kind of interface. Let's maybe do a brief overview of the different moving part. Shamla, do you want to go over the data and the technology part?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, what you see is the tip of the iceberg. That's how I like to call when you are interacting with the voice assistant, right? You're just looking at the interaction, like you're talking to it. But there are a lot of moving pieces which is involved in it. And the first and foremost thing is the technology aspect of things. Right from when you are speaking, your spoken words are interpreted by the machine, converted into machine readable format through a speech recognition system, which is called the ASR or speech to text systems. Then whatever you have said, the machine needs to understand those things. So let's say you said, what is the weather in Seattle, right? So the machine needs to understand the intent of the user, and that is where the natural language understanding piece comes into play, where it tries to understand your intent, like, oh, the user meant weather. So the user wants to know the weather information. Now, where do I get that information? That is where the fulfillment logic comes into play. Maybe there's a dialogue manager, there's a back and forth conversation happening. So there are a lot of these kind of moving pieces, which is going to fulfill the user request. And from there, once we have the response back from the data provider, let's say weather API in this case. So once we have the information, it's in a machine readable format, which again has to be converted into a human readable format. Which is using the text-to-speech engines. You will convert all the things in a more human, listenability-worthy information, and then present it to the user. Because the input modality was voice, the output modality is also voice. But throughout each of these things, it seems very straightforward, right? Like there are these many engines which works, but each of these engines, in order for them to work, requires a lot of different kind of data. So there's language data which is required. There's data about the words and the accents and all of these. The speech recognition system will not be able to just understand the spoken words if it does not have the accents or the pronunciation or enunciations and things like that. So it's really important for it to first of all understand those things. The natural language system will not work if it doesn't have the intent and utterances. So let's say if your system just says, has like, what is the weather in Seattle, and does not have any other utterances, it will not work. If you said, do I need an umbrella? So you need to really make sure, like, in order to make a natural language system, you are adding as much information and data about all of these different utterances so that you are training the system. Because digital assistant is nothing, or a voice assistant is nothing. It is an artificial intelligence system, which is completely dependent on AI, machine learning, and a lot of data to train the system.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to the user interface, and the other part that is really important is to have persona, the conversations built up, and the content, right? Susan and Angel, do you want to discuss that? Maybe we can start with Angel and the persona part.
Yeah, well, persona is, the aspect of a character that's presented to the world, in this case, the users, and it's perceived in the case of a digital assistant largely through voice. And in many cases, persona is kind of like the welcome mat for welcoming the users to interacting with a digital assistant that speaks to them. And when a user hears the digital assistant's voice and what it portrays, they'll automatically try to associate it with a certain personality. And therefore,
Oof, I think we lost Angel for a second. Okay. Maybe
no worries. Susan, you want to say something about the persona?
Yeah, sure. So from a marketing and another perspective, when we talk about persona, there's Angel. I'll let her come back. Is she back?
I'm back.
Okay, I'll let you finish your thought.
Okay.
Yeah, technical difficulties here, but and trying to be in the welcome mat, I think trying to be consistent with having a persona portray across multiple languages is very important, and it becomes an interesting challenge for teams to think about this as they're trying to build out the voice in all the different markets.
Yeah, Susan, do you have any?
Yeah, the other part about that persona that's important is, so there's 3 personas. So there's your user persona, where you think about your constraints and all of those pieces. There's also the brand persona, which may not be what your assistant or system persona, because sometimes your brand spokesperson or icon has never spoken before. So that's a loaded question. And how does that work again across, it might not work across a voice, or what language it speaks might not work across multiple regions. So the idea is definitely to think about how that persona in the assistant works, not just globally, but also within your brand. It very much embodies, it's your brand without you saying, I'm this brand. So it's a challenge of figuring out how do you subtly get a brand into something without it getting in the way, because that's the most important part. Assistants have assistant right in their name. And so that's their #1 job, as opposed to being your busker for your brand. So it's important to think through all of those aspects.
Yeah, so, and it's very important to, to get started. If if your plan is, if your brand is global, you have to start from a global perspective. You'll have to design your persona in a way that will work in multiple markets, and then, to build dialogues that will work in multiple markets. That's very challenging. I mean, this is challenging for one market. So when you deploy globally, it's many times more challenging. What about the dialogues and the conversations? Do you want to say something about that, from a multilingual and global perspective?
So I can start. For being a global brand, definitely, when you are thinking about utterances, first of all, of course, it will be different, because even when I'm trying to, because English is not my native language, so when I'm trying to say something, it's always translated from my native language, right? So the same way, when the user is trying to speak in their language, the utterances might be completely different. So there may be like local slangs or local version of what they are speaking. So if I'm saying, do I need an umbrella? Maybe there's a different variant of the same thing in a specific language. So when you are creating a multilingual assistant, you need to first of all think about those kind of things, like what kind of utterances do you feed in for each of the different languages in different regions, right? Now, the second part of it is the prompt itself, because dialogue is made out of the user said utterances and the system spoken prompts. So the prompt itself has to be translated into the different languages. Now, we cannot truly translate it using a Google translator or something and say it's translated. There's a personality aspect, like Angel and Susan mentioned, right? So there's a brand. Ford is a brand, and we need to make sure the same brand is reflected throughout, because Ford brand is not change based on the region. So the same thing happens with the voice assistant. And I would like to add, like, voice assistant is like an employee of the company. Regardless of where you are working, you have to represent the same brand, right? So when you are thinking about the prompts, you still have to make sure the personality aspect is carried and the brand traits are carried and all of those are carried. So it should not be completely different. For example, if Alexa is perceived as sassy and funny, it will not change depending on the region. So how do you now design the prompts in a way locally for that specific region or language, so that it still perceives as the same brand traits or personalities which we want it to? And that's where the challenge and complication comes, because it's not just through translation. There's a lot of different aspects. What can be funny in English may completely change depending on some other region. And that is why localization or translations are so complicated.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Angel, do you have anything to add?
I think it's also important to think about, like, with a voice, you have to figure out how can a voice capture kind of like friendliness, and how can you use content to then make it so that the user can trust the digital assistant, for example, and like kind of whatever actions that the user wants the digital assistant to do, whether it's kind of doing an action like searching something for the user or engaging in a game for the user. And how can we use dialogue to understand that user's intent and be sensitive to kind of what they need? And without consistency in your story of what the digital assistant is and what its attributes, then a persona could be fractured, and a user may lose that trust and have that sense of like, oh, this assistant is unpredictable. And so in trying to kind of make sure that everything is consistent and cohesive in your story, then the content becomes really important.
Yeah, and with voice, there seems to be even more sensitivity to that than with other interfaces, probably because it's so immediate and we react in a way that is quite different. So let's stay on that maybe. So if we think about different interfaces, you know, tapping, typing, and voice, it seems to me that voice is the most challenging to design because the user comes to it in a very natural way, and human conversation communication is extremely complex. So there's a great burden on the design of the interface, right? Because you really have to try to be up there with the human standards from day one. So a user-centric design it's paramount, it's very important. At the same time, the user persona is difficult to define because you don't quite know who is on the other side, right? It could be, you know, an entire family with, you know, from grandpa to grandchild, or it could just be a child interacting with it. You just don't know. So it's difficult to really target a user persona. When you add the multilingual and multicultural aspect, it becomes really, really challenging. But you probably have some best practices that you can share. How do you navigate this puzzle that is really, really complex? Angel, would you like to start on that?
Sure. I think some guiding principles, at least on the assistant personality team, is to be as conversational as possible. And when it comes to the content, trying to use plain language as much as possible, and keeping those answers and sentences short so that the users can kind of have these like bite-sized pieces to then understand. Especially, you know, when you are writing, and if let's say you're giving options, I think in general conversation design is to, you know, keep those options short, keep it down to 3. I think if you have more than that, there's a cognitive load on the user to think about, oh, what was that first one again, after you've heard a very, very long sentence. And some, you know, in kind of writing these types of sentences, you know, one really nice principle is to kind of read the sentences that you're creating for the assistant out loud. And you know, when you're reading out loud, if you know, a writer or any kind of content designer is thinking, oh, that's starting to become a very long sentence, I should probably think about how do I kind of re-edit this to make it shorter so that my user, regardless of the demographic of the user, can understand it. And I think that's really important for, I think, writing from a conversational style.
Yeah. Susan, how do you see that playing out in different brands? How do they navigate that?
So while it can be, and this is one of the big challenges, and when we even talk about advertising and voice, the biggest challenge is who's in the room, because we won't know. We always like to start with solving for voice so that my visuals basically can't bail me out. One of the things with digital is that, like, if all else fails with my copy, I can show a picture. Well, with a voice only experience, I can't do that. I have to think through, how do I then break that down to the most simple? In a marketing perspective, while your audience may be everyone, and some of the clients I've worked with, like an international credit card, their audience was everyone. However, you have to put some priorities down. And that's where then you start to think through, and that's how you can start to get at that persona, and thinking through also top tasks of what is it, why are they here in the first place? What is their intent, and how does that then match with what my brand can solve? And that at least lets us get to a simple place, not so simple, but it's at least a singular place. And then from there, we can start to then tease out, okay, these are the conversations we need to have. These are the dialogues. This is how this works. A lot of times I'll spend 20% of my time figuring out what we call the happy path of if everything went right, here's the linear. And then 80% of my time of how are they getting off? How do I get them back on it? And then adding on that layer. Once I've got that figured out in a standard base, I think through, okay, so adding additional languages, what are the nuances that change for that? So that there's like a core, and then you start to add in for localization or any of those other pieces of how you approach it. So that's one of the ways we can try to get at that. And then I think the most important part is you start with that, you do your QA, and then you watch your logs as close as possible after launch to see what real users are using. That's one of the most really neat things about voice, is that it is so dynamic. Once it's in the wild, that's really where the fun begins of understanding exactly what your user's doing.
I would like to add a couple of things to this thing, right? Coming from a UX background, and I think, Susan, you will agree with me, information architecture cannot be missed, and that is so important. So when you are thinking about a touch-based interaction, there are A, B, or C. These are the three different kind of interactions which is possible. But with voice, your interaction could be A, B, C, D, E, or sometimes A to C, C to D, B to E, something like that, which is completely different. It can go in any direction. And that is why information architecture becomes so important. So first and foremost, lay out the entire experience out there. Like, okay, if I'm creating a weather information, which is a very simple kind of thing, but let's talk about a more conversational, like maybe add a pizza or some voice commerce kind of thing. There are so many things which can happen. It's not linear that I will search for a product, select a product, add it to the cart, check out. It can be all over the place, can go back and forth. So thinking about that experience, creating your high level information architecture of, how the conversation can flow and from where, can really help you think about how to design the dialogues. Going back to Angel's point, like that's when you can start thinking about like, okay, if I have multiple responses, how do I present that responses? How do I give the user the option to go back or skip a step or repeat a step and things like that. So that's one part which is really very important when thinking about it. Now, you spoke about target audiences. Audiences could be anyone. You still have to define your target audiences. You cannot just go with that open-ended saying, everyone is my audience. You still have to define, right? So yes, the target audiences, maybe if you are designing for a specific, you have a set of users you will have to define as primary, and then secondary and tertiary users. So the primary user is what you design for, but your interactions, your conversations should still count for the secondary and tertiary users and have some kind of things. Maybe the primary user is me shopping for, products. My kid might use it. If that is the situation, how do I account for that? Maybe I'll add some sort of pin or something like that so that there's a security aspect as well, or the dialogue system is such that it understands who the user is. There are so many different ways to think about the design. It can go in any direction, but thinking about your audiences is equally important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, right now it's pretty common thinking that, all these different interfaces will survive. It's not that voice is going to take over. But I think that, until before the pandemic, voice was considered a bit of a residual category. Like, if you have your hands full, then you can interact with voice. But right now there have been a lot of different use cases, and I think that this is changing. So all these interfaces will survive, but there probably will be a more targeted application. So how do you see that playing out at the moment? Like, which parameters will be fundamental to choosing between one type of interface and another?
It's the convenience, right? It's the convenience. So it's I wouldn't say like pandemic might have added a little bit more when it comes to touch-free experiences, but still I would not say touch-free experience means that it is eyes-free as well. Voice first is there, but still there's multimodality aspect as well, right? And completely depends on what your goal is, right? If you are thinking about voice assistant at home, we've been using it for all sorts of things. And of late, I've started realizing, initially I was like, do I really need a voice assistant to turn on my light or things like that? And do I really need a voice assistant to help me with my meditation sessions? That's how I used to think in the past. I have my phone, and now it's completely different, because now I'm like, well, if I have to meditate before my sleeping hours, I don't want to touch my screen for the 40 minutes before I sleep. I'm like very strict about my routine. So if I have to do meditation during that 40 hours to wind down, maybe a voice assistant would be helpful if I can just replay my meditation and turn off the light, so I'm not doing anything and still getting. So these are the kind of things people will think about when they are thinking about use cases, like what is important for them, right? There's so many industries, like healthcare is picking up, asking all sorts of information. Education is one thing Julie has been evangelizing and pushing for, voice in education. There's drive-throughs where voice assistants are being experimented. So it's not just about use cases from the COVID standpoint, but some of those are utility from the user experience standpoint, like what as a user I want. But in other cases, I feel it's more to do with how can I reduce the operation cost for the company? What can I do so that it is seamless and feasible? So drive through, if you have to wait in a long line in order to give your order and pick your order, because there is one person taking the order and then getting through all of the things, it's a lot of effort. If it is a voice assistant, all I'm doing is giving my order, that's it, and waiting for it. So the time has drastically reduced, right? So companies are thinking about these kind of things when they are thinking about voice assistants, not that pandemic has added to it or not, but more from the utility, from the optimization and the cost reduction and things like this.
But we have seen a lot of growth in the last year, right?
Yeah.
So which other parameters, Susan, do you have anything to add?
Sure. I think that I echo Shamala's sentiment of, I think that when it came to that development of voice use cases, or actually the reason for voice, I mean, more of that and the value of it, that was already on its way. There was, what we did see though, is we did see a little more of a mental adoption model in users. Even though this isn't voice related, we saw that people who have never made a purchase before on using a digital device, they did it for the first time, and guess what? They found out they liked it. And so we were able to get, and that was only what, 5% of laggards, but just that's some of the behavioral changes that happened there, of where we got into that thought of, I don't want to touch things, those things. That's kind of accelerated people saying, can I do that without touching? So it started to put that question. I think one of the things that we are looking at, and like as a community, is that whole idea of what I call a user maturity model, and understanding, even if I can launch a rocket with my voice right now, does someone really want to, or are they comfortable? Because it's phenomenal to be able to do that. But right now, what are those use cases that make sense to make someone start to build that comfort? We saw it with mobile apps that were like the beer drinking with their smartphone, and even fart jokes. But what we are also moving them along to is, what questions can you ask it? How do I prompt it? And that's again where in marketing, we have to use all of our channels, not just the voice channel, to say, you can do this here. You can do this because it's going to be faster. And so instead of on my whole music, I'm sending someone to a website, I might say, check out, you can actually interface through our voice assistant, and helping people and guide them through that. There's lots of ways, as Shamala has talked through, is that there's efficiency from operations that work. There's always the joke of Alexa, start the meeting, all of those types of ideas. So those use cases come into, when I look at a customer journey from awareness, consideration, purchase, retention, where am I having challenges and where can voice fit? And that's where then my use cases kind of fall out of, if it can answer that faster, or it can help someone complete a task, then that's a place I'm going to explore and look through it. But a lot of times we'll look at it from awareness, consideration, and purchase, because it's just such a wide swath. We want to make sure that we prioritize, so then we get back to that, what's the core reason, so then I can make sure that with all the responses it works.
Yeah. Have you seen major changes on the Google Assistant, Angel, in terms of the way people use it, or the kind of questions that are asked?
I think with the Google Assistant, with the pandemic kind of happening. There's a lot of features that kind of accelerated its discovery or at least users discovered it faster in that sense. And there's been a lot of like push, whether, you know, as Susan mentioned, like through other channels, like especially in like, hey, you can try it. If social media tells us like, hey, you can try doing this type of action, and then users will then discover it, and then they'll also kind of like prompt you and say like, hey, you can also try using your voice to prompt this action. And so then because of these kind of marketing and encouragement, so to speak, users become more comfortable and engaged in using these types of things. And especially with voice, I think, especially in a lot of different types of markets where in some cases, text input is kind of the more comfortable thing. When they start realizing that they can use voice instead, it's kind of like a natural progression for them to start going from text to then voice. But then also in some other markets where maybe depending on kind of the market user, if voice is kind of like their first interaction, then of course that kind of engagement kind of just accelerates and grows a lot faster. And so it really depends on kind of the nature of the market and the nature of the users that are kind of engaging with these kind of voice assistants. And so there's probably an increased growth for users who are familiar with text and now with voice because of, you know, maybe they don't want to touch their hands for something like Susan mentioned. So that growth on the Google Assistant has been, we've seen a lot of growth there. And also because folks are largely at home, a lot of voice queries become used, and largely because of the convenience, like especially in a family where they have to, you know, call for their children in another room, for example, then there's, you know, certain features that you can like then use the Google Assistant kind of like to help assist the parent to then reach out to the children, for example.
That's interesting. So broadly, you know, the growth follows the current growth in the digital and audio space, and voice is just following suit. So right now, most brands that want to build something with voice might just choose to, you know, go with an Alexa skill or a Google action or something like that. But there is increasing interest from brands to actually build their own independent voice assistants, right? Susan, do you see growth in brands? How are brands catching up with voice experiences?
I think to your point, smart speakers are almost their own ecosystem, how they live and what they are. And when you start to invest into, and when I think of the evolution of how a brand might adopt voice, we start with an idea of they optimize things, right? They optimize the content they have. They might just start with voice search, or they might start to look at their mobile app and how do I optimize that to be able to do speech to text or speech for input. And then they move into this idea of creation. And that's where then things start to become interesting in the idea of, does it make sense? Is there a big enough reason for me to create my own personalized assistant? And then that assistant can then be, how do I populate and distribute that assistant? Is that through, well, what digital channels or what devices? You know, we saw that Mercedes just started straight with the vehicle. So it's kind of thinking through that. That's what we're seeing more and more. And then like the final maturity level is that fully integrated experience of where I have this voice assistant, I've created it, and I'm going to use that everywhere. And do I use the Google Assistant or Alexa to assist? Sure. And then working through that, but it is kind of thinking through how it all fits within part of it. So that's what we're seeing, what brands are toying with right now. When they think of the idea of their own assistant, for sure, because they also don't want to acquiesce their brand to say the Alexa voice or the Google voice, that's leaving money on the table. So it's okay, then I guess I am going down this path because I want to own the word, not just the words, I want to own the sound, because sonic branding is becoming so important. Yeah. That's what they need to develop.
Yeah. So if I'm a brand and I want to get started with my own voice assistant, independent voice assistant, what would you say is the biggest factor in terms of costs?
That's a really great question. Shamala, do you want to jump in? I see you just came off mute.
There are a lot of things, right? So, I mean, first of all, if you have to build your own assistant, you have to think about all the different engines which we spoke about, because all of those build up to creating the assistant. So either you can choose to bundle up and use an assistant like a single company to do all of the things, right? Like Alexa have opened its tech stack, or Silence is there, SoundHound, or any such companies, which can give you the entire bundle. But the second thing is, if you don't want to do that, and if you want to do a mix and match, you have to look at not just the engines like ASR, NLU, and TTS engines, and your dialog manager system, your knowledge base system, and how do you tie each of these things. You also have to look at your system architecture, and coming from a world where it's the most complicated experience, like designing experiences for the car, the architecture is way too complicated. So the engine which we are choosing should also work with our architecture and our operating system and all of those things. So it's not just like plug and play and I can just deploy anything, right? Unlike if I'm using Google, it's Android, and if I have Android OS, maybe I'm able to deploy it, or maybe, the way it works is they already have built something for the Google Auto Services, so we can just deploy that. But again, it's just one part of it. There's additional cost, the learning of the tools, because every tool is different. So if we are using any such tools, we need to also understand how it works. For example, the conversational platform. So if you are using a conversational platform with these things, do they have direct integration? Is it their own interface, or is it a third-party interface? Then there's a learning curve with every tool that comes. You have to also train the skills. So we are talking about millions of dollars if you have to build something, right? So companies have to think about the strategic advantages of, do I build something versus buy? Again, there's use cases which we spoke about. There are some use cases which Amazon and Google are great at doing, like what's in my calendar, or like things like that. And there are some use cases which the vehicle or the other companies will be good at doing, like find me a Starbucks, or like what's in my vehicle, when is my schedule, and things like that. Now, do we want to reinvent the wheel, trying to add the appointment thing from the scratch into our system, or do we want to have a different strategy? So it's always about thinking, where should we win, where should we play, and especially when it comes to the cost and the effort, the time and the resources, and all of those things which we are talking about. Going back to what Susan was saying about voice assistants, like if we are giving all the opportunity or advantage to Google and Alexa, we are leaving a lot of money on the table, right? And voice assistant, like I mentioned, is the employee of the company. So when someone is interacting with a brand, and there's an assistant of one brand, you will directly connect with that brand. Who's getting the competitive advantage? Is it Google? Is it Alexa? Is it your brand? What do you want? So it's also thinking about the brand strategy and broader perspective as well when you are creating an assistant.
Yeah. So at the moment, like, costs are still really, really high, but probably as they come down, we'll see greater adoption even by smaller brands, right?
One thing I just want to add on that too, to piggyback on that, is the idea of what's your purpose? Why do you want that assistant? If you need reach, then you look at the smart speakers. They're in 90 million households, especially if you're in a US market. Or you look at where Google Assistant is, because it's also not just on the speaker, it's on the phone. And we see that. So if you've got that and you need that reach, if you start thinking about, and these are the ways that I think help a marketing client understand it, is how much would a spot cost? How much would a TV spot cost? Okay, it's not such a crazy number now. And thinking through that, and then you're able to have that repetitive interaction that's a little bit more measured than using a TV ad. Not to make TV, the TV has its purpose, it has good things, even though a lot of times it gets kind of whipped around these days if it's not as measurable, blah, 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 and all of those things. But that's a way of putting that into perspective when we talk about that expense. So it's making sure it's about, is it about reach? Is it about cost efficiencies, and thinking through that to determine where you step and where you play. It's kind of like the Little Mermaid. I want to go to where the people are. So where is it I need to go?
Do you envision a world where digital assistants will talk to each other independent of us. Like, my airline digital assistant will call my credit card one to solve some issue with the payment, and I have to do nothing at all. They'll solve everything for me and connect with each other.
Isn't Google Duplex towards that? It's already trying to do it. So I feel like, yes, so we will be there. Assistants will be able to talk. Right now, Google Duplex does that, right? Where it is able to talk to the businesses. Maybe in future, it's, more collaborative. We are talking about arbitration between assistants as well, because as more and more assistants comes into play, do we really want one assistant? Do we want to have mix and match or arbitration or things like that, right? So in future, definitely I see this being something where, well, the assistants are talking with each other and is able to get the task done. For the user, doesn't matter who's doing the task. For me, I said, get me the tickets to Disney and I'm getting it. What's happening? I don't care.
There's an issue of trust, right? For the user. Yeah, I mean, the trust in that, whatever these assistants are doing behind your back, you can trust them, and so that's a big element, right? So, the brand name and all of that is going to be very important in that case.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see the question to that. And I think the idea is, I think we all want to live in a world where there is a Jarvis, as I think of where we start with Danger Will Robinson, and that from Lost in Space, and that very rudimentary robot all the way to Jarvis. We don't live near in a world with Jarvis, but it is something that I think everyone wants to work towards. It's still probably closer to the Jetsons Rosie the Robot days, I think. And so it's, yes, we want to move towards that, but we want to do that responsibly. And I guess I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Open Voice Network. And that's the work that they're doing of looking at interoperability. There's actually a workshop coming up right now in June, as well as looking at how does privacy work? What does privacy mean? And what does security mean? Because they're related, but they're not the same. And understanding how do we come up with standards so that we can start to build that trust. Because I think one of the missteps that we, and as web and digital professionals did, is we didn't think hard enough about that because we didn't know we needed to. Yeah. And this time around, we're a little bit, I like to think we're a bit smarter, maybe a lot smarter, probably not a lot, of thinking through what are the consequences? How do we handle this data? How do we continue to keep that trust? And I think the European Privacy Review Board put some standards out about here's what it means for GDPR and voice. And I know the Open Voice Network is actually putting together a formal response and working together on that. So while the answer isn't it's all fixed, it's perfect, there's like the good news is someone's working on it, and it's actually a not-profit trade association, so that it's actually the intent is that it'll be a little more objective than if it were just a bunch of companies coming together to pull out their own things. It's organizing all of that together into like one voice.
Yeah, and there is the definitely the public, the user perspective in that. I actually I'm part of the OVN as well, as you know. Yes, it's a very interesting organization. So one last thing, Angel, since you have a background in localization, what do you think the globalization and localization industries can do to support this, this new channel, and make sure that, we learn from the past experiences, where I feel that with other interfaces, we were not as quick to really think about how to localize and all of that. We were still thinking more in terms of just translate words. So we did not consider the entire experience. But with voice, because we are still at the beginning, we can actually do that.
I think language is so fluid, and there's so many new words and phrases that are getting coined. And so I think what the globalization and localization industry can do with, all the language experts and is to try to capture some of these local adaptations so that it can help to ensure that this data gathering that Shamal mentioned in the past, earlier in our conversation, is like all those words and phrases can be part of this larger technology, and so that the voice can, if users are asking like a digital assistant, for example, then the system can understand it and understand that user's intent, even if it's like a new word or a new phrase, or even like a mixed language, like English, for example. If the technology can understand the user's intent and produce the correct actions that the user is asking for, then the users will be more likely to engage with it and feel like, oh, this digital assistant understands me. It could be hip because it speaks two languages, or it speaks a mixed language. And so that in itself will then continue to increase the user's engagement and also the user's trust in kind of like interacting with the different assistants and the actions that it can offer to the user. And to have the language experts like kind of keep abreast on like all these kind of new words, phrases, viral sensations that are going on in the local markets will then allow those local assistants or local versions of these digital assistants be more relevant and more culturally appropriate to the market and the users that they serve. And so I think being able to kind of have that language understanding and capability and kind of contribute to the systems that kind of build it is probably very key for this industry.
Yeah. Well, right now, I mean, they still struggle a bit when there are mixes of languages, right? But have you seen a change? Have you seen an improvement in that sense? I think this is more at the level of technology, right?
Yeah, it's definitely at the level of technology. And I think, I can only speak for Google, but it's something that Google is very invested in, and to kind of continue to try to have more natural conversations with the users, to meet the users where they are, and in trying to develop that and understand the user is like very key for us to have like a very seamless experience, regardless of how they use the language.
Yeah, for people who speak multiple languages, it's funny sometimes, because if I say something, I mean, if I have my assistant in English and I say something in Italian with an Italian pronunciation, it will struggle to understand it. It wants me to pronounce it with an English accent, and the other way with Italian. I mean, it's a a problem that I think all the voice experiences have at this point, or even with Chinglish and English, they are still struggling, but we'll probably get there hopefully soon. Shamala, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I feel like part is we are constantly evolving from where we are, right? And part of it is the data collection, and how much data are we collecting and who are we collecting that data from? And that's one part. So diversity is important in order to design for diverse population. So even people in your team should be diverse when you're designing, right? So if you have all male white American people designing voice assistant for global population, there will be problems. So I feel like it's really important to even think about diversity in the skill sets and also the data which we are collecting, because that is how we can improve the experiences and make it more global. And when I say that, I know a lot of companies are doing this, where especially in India, we have so many languages within India. So it's not one language. And it's the same here also, right? We have so many slangs and dialects in English alone. So when it comes to regions, there are so many different variants. And my native language can be spoken in like 10 different ways. And I don't know all of those things, but people can speak English also in so many different ways. So when you are doing, you have to make sure you are testing it out with them, collecting as much data with those kind of population who are actually going to use your system, right? So it's not just doing some sort of looking at some YouTube videos and collecting that data. Maybe you have to collect data in a different way. You have to really understand what's the best way to get that information so that you are training the system. Because like I mentioned, digital assistant is nothing, a bunch of artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms working to understand what you're saying, and it's all data heavy. So that's what I would say, that like diversification is important for diversification.
Yeah. Do you think that voice has a potential to help preserve some of the spoken languages around the world, and preserve the oral tradition? I think that, you know, a few centuries back, we kind of switched to written text, and we lost a bit that oral tradition that used to be very, very rich. But maybe, you know, with this new technology, we can re-explore that and just, you know, be more switched on with the audio and voice rather than the text and typing.
Absolutely. When I was at SAP's, one of their think tanks over in New York, it was a few years ago even, they actually were testing, prototyping, and working through projects that were capturing oral tradition. This particular project was focused on capturing Mexican-American culture. And as families have come through, is understanding what is a quinceanera, how do you, and not just making it a Wikipedia article, but having important Mexican Americans talk through what their quinceanera was like and allowing others to put within that. There's also projects I've seen of capturing loved ones, because nothing is more powerful when you've lost someone than hearing them tell you a story, or what does it sound like? I mean, it's incredibly powerful to hear your grandfather many years after, you know, he has passed on. So though that oral tradition absolutely comes into play, it's also, you have the barrier then of not having to write it down, whether or not you can write it, but just hearing it and speaking it. There is an opportunity to be able to cover that. And I think that's also where, as we were talking about those models, where linguists become so important in helping us navigate those areas, and then just continually trying to make steps forward to be, you know, to have that recognized better in those pieces, because that seems to be, based on the research that we've been seeing, is that that's one of the most important parts, is being understood before someone will build on to that trust factor.
Yeah, and Shamla was mentioning India. I think India has like 3,000 languages and dialects, and so many of those are only spoken, right? So, you know, it could be a channel for you know, building better connectivity and also preserving these languages, because you'll need the data if you want to make it a channel. So
yeah, absolutely, it's a lot of effort for sure, but if you know, it's going to, like I mentioned, you know, like urbanization is very important, and our hackathon is focusing on urbanization, women's safety, and campsite, and all of these things. As we start to think about voice assistants everywhere, we have to start thinking about the reach. We have to start thinking about, you know, how is it improving and helping in the urbanization or connectivity and things like that. So voice is definitely going to become one big modality for people who are able to use it. I will say that in quotes, because there are still disabled population we have to be thinking for. Voice is not for them, especially if you cannot speak, right? But still we can make voice inclusive for them by adding multimodality or different interactions. So it's a mix and match kind of thing, which is very important to be thinking about, because if voice is the future, and if we are thinking about using this for the advancement of the ecosystem, then we also have to think about inclusivity as well.
absolutely.